The Battle of Surabaya was fought between pro-independence Indonesian soldiers and militia against British and British Indian troops as a part of the Indonesian National Revolution. The peak of the battle was in November 1945. The battle was the heaviest single battle of the revolution and became a national symbol of Indonesian resistance. Considered a heroic effort by Indonesians, the battle helped galvanize Indonesian and international support for Indonesian independence. The 10th of November is celebrated annually as Heroes' Day. Ferocious fighting erupted on the 30th of October when 600 Indian troops perished alongside the British commander, Brigadier A.W.S. Malaby. The British retaliated with a punitive sweep that began on the 10th of November, under the cover of air attacks. Although the European forces largely captured the city in 3 days, the poorly armed Republicans fought for 3 weeks, and thousands died as the population fled to the countryside. Despite the military defeat suffered by the Republicans and a loss of manpower and weaponry that would severely hamper Republican forces for the rest of the revolution, the battle and defense mounted by the Indonesians galvanized the nation in support of independence and helped garner international attention. For the Dutch, it removed any doubt that the Republic was not simply a gang of collaborators without popular support. It also had the effect of convincing Britain that wisdom lay on the side of neutrality in the revolution. Within a few years, in fact, Britain would support the Republican cause in the United Nations. Background: on the 17th of August 1945, Sukarno and Hatta declared the independence of Indonesia in Jakarta, 2 days after the Japanese Emperor's surrender in the Pacific. As the news about the independence declaration spread throughout the archipelago, ordinary Indonesians felt a sense of freedom that led most to regard themselves as pro-Republican. In the following weeks, power vacuums existed, both from outside and within Indonesia, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty, but also one of opportunity. On the 19th of September 1945, a group of Dutch internees supported by the Japanese raised the Dutch flag outside the Hotel Yamato in Surabaya, East Java. This provoked nationalist Indonesian militia, who overran the Dutch and Japanese and tore off the blue part of the Dutch flag, changing it into the Indonesian flag. The leader of the Dutch group, Mr. Ploegman, was killed because of mass anger. The senior Japanese commander in Surabaya, Vice Admiral Shibata Ichiro, supported the Republicans and gave Indonesians ready access to arms. On the 3rd of October, he surrendered to a Dutch Navy captain, the first Allied representative to arrive. Ichiro ordered his forces to hand over their remaining weapons to the Indonesians. The Indonesians were to hand them to the Allies but neglected to do so. British forces brought in a small Dutch military contingent which it termed the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration. The British became worried about the increasing boldness and apparent strength of the nationalists, who attacked demoralized Japanese garrisons across the archipelago with rudimentary weapons such as bamboo spears to seize their arms. The main goals of British troops in Surabaya were seizing weapons from Japanese troops and Indonesian militia, taking care of former prisoners of war, and sending the remaining Japanese troops back to Japan. In September and October 1945, a series of incidents took place involving pro-Dutch Eurasians, and atrocities were committed by Indonesian mobs against European internees. In late October and early November, the leadership of the mass Muslim organizations Nahdlatul Ulama and Masyumi declared that war in defense of the Indonesian fatherland was holy war, and thus an obligation for all Muslims. KYAI and their students began to stream into Surabaya from Islamic boarding schools throughout East Java. The charismatic Bung Tomo made use of local radio to encourage an atmosphere of fanatical revolutionary fervor across the city. 6,000 British Indian troops were sent into the city on the 25th of October to evacuate European internees, and within 3 days fighting began. After heavy fighting between the British Indian forces and around 20,000 Indonesian armed regulars of the newly formed People's Security Army and mobs of 70,000–140,000 people, the British flew in the influential President Sukarno, Vice President Hatta and his ministers Amir Syarafuddin, and a ceasefire was achieved on 30 October. Prelude. On 26 October 1945, Brigadier A.W.S. Malabi reached an agreement with Mr. Suyo, the Republic of Indonesia's governor of East Java, that the British would not ask Indonesian troops, militia to hand over their weapons. An apparent misunderstanding about the agreement between British troops in Jakarta and Malabi's troops in Surabaya was to have serious ramifications. Initially, British troops were 6,000 strong lightly armed Indian soldiers from 49th Infantry Brigade of the 23rd Indian Division. When the battle reached its peak, the British sent additional troops which consisted of 24,000 fully armed soldiers from the 5th Indian Division, 24 Sherman tanks, 24 armed aircraft, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Indonesian forces consisted of 20,000 soldiers from the newly formed Tentara Keamanan Rakyat and an estimated 100,000–120,000 irregulars. TKR was formed by the former members of PETA, a semi-military organization during Japanese occupation. The irregulars consisted of pro-independence mob, armed with rifles, swords, and bamboo spears. Some of their weapons were taken from surrendered Japanese troops. Battle. Beginning on 27 October 1945, a British plane from Jakarta dropped leaflets over Surabaya urging all Indonesian troops and militia to surrender their weapons. The leaders of the Indonesian troops and militia were angered, seeing it as a breaking of the agreement reached with Malabi earlier. On 28 October 1945, they attacked the British troops in Surabaya, killing 200 soldiers. On 30 October the British flew Sukarno, Muhammad Hatta, and Amir Syarafuddin Harahap into Surabaya to possibly negotiate a ceasefire. A ceasefire was negotiated with Major General Hawthorne and Brigadier Malabi and immediately adhered to. Fighting, however, soon recommenced due to confused communications and mistrust between the two sides, leading to the famed Battle of Surabaya. Death of Brigadier Malabi. On 30 October 1945, Brigadier A.W.S. Malabi, the British brigade commander in Surabaya, was travelling about Surabaya to spread the news about the new agreement to his troops. At this time, Malabi's team were forbidden to bring any weapons except hand grenades. Later, while patrolling, they received information that there was a mass of Indonesian militia advancing to International Bank near Jembatan Merah. The team headed to the area, but were trapped by shooting between Dutch soldiers who guarded the bank and local militias. When his car approached the British troops post in the International Building near the Jembatan Merah, his car was surrounded by Indonesian Republican militia. Shortly after, Malabi was shot and killed by the militia under confused circumstances. Captain R.C. Smith, who was in the stationary car, reported that a young Republican suddenly shot and killed Malabi after a short conversation. Smith then reported throwing a grenade from the car in the direction of where he thought the shooter had hidden. Although he was not sure whether or not it hit its target, the explosion caused the back seat of the car to ignite. Other accounts, according to the same source, stated that it was the explosion and not a shooter that killed Malabi. The remaining members of Malabi's team ran and jumped into the Kalimas River. The death of Malabi incited instant reaction in Allied army because they knew Malabi was on a non-combat mission that day. Regardless of its exact details, Malabi's death was a significant turning point for the hostilities in Surabaya, and a catalyst for the battle to come. The British ordered an Indonesian surrender, and on 10 November they rolled out a large retaliatory attack. The main battle Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christison was angered when he heard that Brigadier Malabi had been killed in Surabaya. During a lull in the fighting, the British brought in reinforcements and evacuated the internees. An additional 2 brigades of the 5th Indian Division led by Major General Robert Manzurg were deployed with Sherman and Stuart tanks, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers in support. At dawn on the 10th of November, a day now commemorated in Indonesia as Heroes' Day, British troops began a methodical advance through the city under the cover of naval and air bombardment. Fighting was heavy, with British troops clearing buildings room by room and consolidating their gains. Despite the fanatical resistance of the Indonesians, half of the city was conquered in 3 days and the fighting over in 3 weeks. Estimates of Indonesian deaths range between 6,300 and 15,000, and perhaps 200,000 fled the devastated city. British Indian casualties totaled approximately 600. Aftermath: the Republicans lost much of their manpower, but it was the loss of weaponry that would severely hamper Republican military efforts for the remainder of the independence struggle. The Battle for Surabaya was the bloodiest single engagement of the war, and demonstrated the determination of the ragtag nationalist forces. Their sacrificial resistance became a symbol and rallying cry for the revolution. It also made the British reluctant to be sucked into a war, considering how stretched their resources in Southeast Asia were during the period after the Japanese surrender. Within a few years, in fact, Britain openly supported the Republican cause in the United Nations. It was also a watershed for the Dutch as it removed any doubt that the Republic was a well-organized resistance with popular support. In November 1946, the last British troops left Indonesia. The Heroes of the 10th of November statue in Surabaya commemorates this battle. The 10th of November is now commemorated in Indonesia as Heroes' Day, in memory of the battle. The Scottish-American Indonesian sympathizer Kut Tantri also witnessed the Battle of Surabaya, which she later recorded in her memoirs Revolt in Paradise. Prior to the fighting, she and a group of Indonesian rebels associated with Bung Tomo had established a secret radio station in the city which broadcast pro-Indonesian Republic messages that were directed at the British soldiers in the city. She noted that several British soldiers were unhappy with the Dutch for misleading them about the Indonesian Republicans being Japanese puppets and extremists. Following the British bombardment of the city, Tantri contacted several foreign diplomats and commercial attachés from Denmark, Switzerland, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Sweden. These countries had representatives in Surabaya. They agreed to inform their respective governments about the fighting in Surabaya and to take part in a joint broadcast protesting the British military operations. Legacy. The battle was shown briefly in the 2013 film Sangkirai, which depicted the death of Brigadier Malabi at the hands of an Indonesian militia from Laskar Hizbullah and the first day of the battle itself. In 2013, the Battle of Surabaya was commemorated in a 2D animated film called The Battle of Surabaya, which was scheduled to be released in August 2015. The film is produced by Muhammad Suryanta and focuses on a teenage courier named Muso. On a side note, Disney took an interest of this animation, as the movie is now part of the Disney's franchise for its distribution. It was said that the film will also have an English voiceover outside Indonesia residents, after the movie's original release date in Indonesia.